Welcome to Why Is This Good, a podcast by the Naples Writers Workshop. I'm Christine and I'm here with John. Hey, John.
Hello.
Well, it's my turn. And in keeping with, I believe, what was my last selection, I have resorted to Googling short stories that were later turned into films because I've run out of ways to come across good writing. And unlike John, I don't sit around reading for pleasure. You'd think I would. No, I think this is also a cool way to kind of compare because after we did Arrival, and the story of your life, that was really cool to see, how a story like that can be turned into a film and how both can be really good, but as always, how the original is so much better. So that's how I came across this story. It is Brokeback Mountain by Annie Proulx. It was published originally in the New Yorker as a standalone in 1997, but Brokeback Mountain is the title of a short story within a collection of short stories called Close Range Wyoming Stories. And if I'm remembering this correctly too, according to my notes, the overall collection was, I think, nominated for a Pulitzer.
That would have been our second.
Yeah, it must be nice, Annie. Anyway, so Brokeback Mountain, to refresh your memory, is about two cowboys fall in love. What Jack remembered and craved in a way he could neither help nor understand was the time that distant summer on Brokeback when Ennis had come up behind him and pulled him close, the silent embrace satisfying some shared and sexless hunger. They had stood that way for a long time in front of the fire, its burning, tossing ruddy chunks of light, the shadow of their bodies a single column against the rock. The minutes ticked by from the round watch in Ennis's pocket, from the sticks in the fire settling into coals. Stars bit through the wavy heat layers above the fire. Ennis's breath came slow and quiet. He hummed, rocked a little in the sparklight, and Jack leaned against the steady heartbeat, the vibrations of the humming like faint electricity. And standing, he fell into sleep. That was not sleep, but something else drowsy and tranced, until Ennis, dredging up a rusty but still usable phrase from the childhood time before his mother died, said, "Time to hit the hay, cowboy. I gotta go. Come on, you're sleeping on your feet like a horse," and gave Jack a shake, a push, and went off in the darkness. Jack heard his spurs tremble as he mounted, the words "see you tomorrow," and the horse's shuddering snort, grind of hoof on stone. Later, that dozy embrace solidified in his memory as a single moment of artless, charmed happiness in their separate and difficult lives. Nothing marred it, even the knowledge that Ennis would not then embrace him face to face because he did not want to see nor feel that it was Jack he held. And maybe, he thought, they'd never get much farther than that. Let be, let be.
You'd say Ennis?
Yeah, what were you saying?
Enos. I don't remember how it was said in the movie now. I was thinking about this story because I remember when we read The Story of Your Life, we both agreed that we kind of wished we'd read this story before we had ever seen the movie. And I was trying to think if that was true of this as well. And I don't know how I would have read this story. Now, Brokeback Mountain, I saw the movie, what is this? It's like 15 years old. I saw it a million years ago. So it is part of my history. So I have no idea how I would have read this story had I not seen it, been exposed to it as that movie.
When I read this, of course, it was like, yeah, no wonder this was opted for film too, because there's a tone in this story that was pretty well picked up for the movie. It's a quiet story. There's not a ton of dialogue. It's a quiet film. There's not a ton of dialogue. They're alone on a mountain together and they're both like trapped in their own heads. And so Annie Proulx is doing like the bulk of the heavy lifting, getting into both their heads as the like omniscient close narrator and shifting like, this is what Ennis is thinking. And then this is what Jack is thinking. Like she's just kind of like in there, but this is very much a story too of two characters that never fully express themselves to one another, so that's why the narrator is so powerful here. That's the difficulty of adapting something like this to film, to imply all of these thoughts through acting when you can't say them.
There's when they say goodbye after the summer on Brokeback and they're like, they didn't know how to say goodbye. They didn't know what to do in those moments. And suddenly they were 40 feet apart and all they could do was drive away.
Yeah.
So he's driving away and all of a sudden it describes this really intense physical manifestation of regret or fear or something. He's within a mile. Enos felt like someone was pulling his guts out hand over hand, a yard at a time. He stopped at the side of the road and in the whirling new snow tried to puke, but nothing came up. He felt about as bad as he ever had, and it took a long time for the feeling to wear off. this is such a good description, first off. But what's fascinating, and to play to your point about them, they're communicating and how they fail to communicate, is he then later relays that story to Jack. And the way he tells it, it's like one of those moments where you're like, oh my gosh, he's admitting. It's like, it stands out because it's one of the few times he's admitting his feelings.
Yeah.
In a strange way. It's been 4 years and they get back together again. He says, that summer, said Enos, when we split up after we got paid out, I had gut cramps so bad I pulled over and tried to puke. Thought I ate something bad at that place in Du Bois. Took me about a year to figure out it was that I shouldn't have let you out of my sights. Too late then by a long, long while. That's like one of those rare moments when he is admitting how he felt. And we got to see it before, which is, I like that. I thought it was really cool how she did that.
Yeah. I just love the writing. So it's quiet and all this kind of thing, but I think it's beautiful prose. The section that I read, there's like these long winding sentences, tons of commas. It's almost like Hatchet or Into the Wild. Stories like that where you do have just like a one main character and they're like in touch with the land. It lends itself to a quiet story and then lots of scene description and lots of internal thought description. And I think I like stories like that. Like not a lot's happening, but a lot's happening in their head.
The writing is really, really well done. I mean, we should at least mention the dialect, which is very subtly done. There's like 2 or 3 things that she does in the dialogue to suggest the Wyoming accent.
Right.
Although there's specific mention when Jack moves to Texas, how the way he says cow changes and the way he says wife changes. It's like now he's speaking with that Texas accent. He says cow and wife.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's subtle, but it's effective. And the narrator has the same kind of tone that they do. I'm really fascinated by this narrator because it is, like you said, it's omniscient. It's not really in anybody's head, but it tends to be in Enos's head more.
Yeah, because he lives.
Yeah, it's his point of view. Like we never see Jack's wife she's only referred to her on the phone, never in scene. So they're always with Enos, and like Jack comes into his life and leaves it, and it's like mostly following him. Like there's no scene of him getting beaten, of Jack getting beaten, because it all happens off scene or off the page. So in a lot of ways, the narrative voice tends towards Enos. But I was curious about like this one and near the beginning when they're meeting with the guy who gives him the job on Brokeback.
Yeah.
And he's like running through like what they need to do. You know, gotta camp out with the sheep. You gotta come pick up your supplies. And then when he stops talking right at the end of that paragraph, this looks like it's coming from the narrator, and it says pair of deuces going nowhere. And I was like, whose point of view is that? Where's that coming from?
Yeah, it's at the end of that paragraph and like outside of dialogue.
Yeah, it's like it feels like it should be the narrator, but it's a very it's editorial. It's judging the 2 characters.
It's commenting on what was just said.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, okay, these 2 kids aren't going anywhere. It's like it feels like it's the thoughts of the guy who's given them the job, but it's not quite. It's something else.
Right.
So it's interesting. So there's a point in the middle of the story where Enos says, I goddamn hate it that you're going to drive away in the morning. I'm going back to work. But if you can't fix it, you got to stand it. Yeah. And that's a direct quote from Enos. And at the end of the story, the line it ends on is, there was some open space between what he knew and what he tried to believe, but nothing could be done about it. If you can't fix it, you've got to stand it. So now the narrator is directly quoting him.
Right.
These are ways in which the narrator is, even though it's written as an omniscient, separate narrator, it is Enos in some ways.
Right.
So I'm just fascinated by that, the way that interplay of the narrator and then the characters.
Yeah. We talk about that all the time, like with our workshop, that it can be done, but it's almost hard to instruct how to do it. You just recognize when it's done well. This like slipping in and out of points of view with a narrator that knows everything and like when to do it and how to do it. Obviously, that's the strength of this story, which like we pointed out is about 2 men that aren't expressing themselves to each other. So like this wouldn't be a story if we only got one's perspective, you know? It'd be a very different story. It'd be like a why doesn't he like me story.
Yeah, if it was first person Enos, it was like
it'd be so annoying.
That summer I went up to
I went up to Brokeback Mountain and I was like super into this guy. And instead it's like we get the privilege of knowing that these men are essentially on the same page. Yeah. But like society and whatever else is crippling this situation for them.
I've talked before about how if it uses a metaphor, the metaphor works best if it comes from the world that
I talked about this in our last episode and also 5 seconds ago.
It was the last episode. recently and in an episode a million years ago. But there's the little things when Enos confronts Jack about Mexico, he says he was cutting fence now, trespassing in the shoot 'em zone. That is the kind of metaphor you're going to use in Wyoming, right?
Yeah.
And even the description of what happens between Enos and his wife Alma, it's like slow corrosion work between Enos and Alma, no real trouble, just widening water. That line, widening water, feels it's a natural thing. It's like a landscape kind of metaphor. So it feels very of the place too.
Right.
It's like those ways in which the narrator isn't merely omniscient. The narrator is like speaking out of the land, speaking setting. This line was really interesting. It's after so Jack knees, this is like the last day on Brokeback, right? And Jack knees him in the nose, then Enos punches him, and he said Enos had suddenly swung from the deck and laid the ministering angel out in the wild columbine, wings folded. That is an interesting image.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I feel like these sentences for me are like a dime a dozen. Like she's killing it.
She is.
Annie's fucking killing it. Yeah, she was doing great. And obviously, like, we didn't get into that here as much as we did with our last story where we talked a lot about like the richness of voice and language, but choices like that are the ones that you do it again and again, and like that's what you remember about her tone of voice and her skill with all of this. I imagine too, like if they're all set in Wyoming, that you're getting like tons of beautiful descriptors like that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, the story, it'd be interesting to read the whole, the entire collection, the entire book is subtitled Wyoming Stories, just to see how the narrator is.
Right.
If it's the same narrator throughout, if it's the same omniscient narrator, if it dives into first person, like how she handles that.
This almost reminds me of Lauren Groff.
Oh, yeah.
That narrator.
A little bit. That was first person in hers, wasn't it?
A lot of her stuff is first person, but a lot of it is also like, that third removed. But I don't know. There's something about like the authority that it's written with, like the authority on the character's thoughts and the situation and how it'll play out. Like there's an authority to this story as well, in the sense that the narrator knows how this ends. The narrator knows that they don't get what they want. One of them dies. It never comes to fruition. So it's intentionally chosen, to tell us that story that way. It's not present tense. It's hindsight. There's like an authority that way. It's like, I'm all knowing, but I'm going to unspool it for you so that you appreciate it how they lived it. You don't start this story and say, this is a story about a man that gets killed for being gay and how they never got to be together. She's like, this is what happened. This is what happened next. Now I'm going to show you this. And now I'm going to show you this, so that by the end, you're as upset about it as Ennis would have been.
It is interesting that the New Yorker version doesn't have the first section where we see Enos remember, like he had a dream about Jack the night before and he wakes up like happy. Maybe they related
then to these other stories.
No. That was apparently not printed. It was left out. It was just an accident. Somebody screwed up and left it out.
That's weird.
But that section, like that opening section, kind of frames the whole thing as an Enos story. This is about Enos's memory of Jack.
Yeah.
And that kind of gives excuse to the way the narrator focuses on Enos.
Okay, that makes sense.
Doesn't necessarily visit Texas. We don't get scenes in Texas. We always get scenes of Jack back in Wyoming visiting.
So my takeaway from this, I wanted to read like one section toward the end. It doesn't give anything away. It's on the bottom of 281. But this is from a scene where Ennis has gone to Jack's home and like the parents are being weird, but they're like, you can look at his room if you want. And he starts like picking through his stuff. I just wanted to read it for the language and everything. The shirt seemed heavy until he saw there was another shirt inside it. The sleeves carefully worked down inside Jack's sleeves. It was his own plaid shirt, lost, he thought, long ago in some damn laundry, his dirty shirt, the pocket ripped, buttons missing, stolen by Jack and hidden here inside Jack's own shirt, the pair like two skins, one inside the other, two in one. He pressed his face into the fabric and breathed in slowly through his mouth and nose, hoping for the faintest smoke and mountain sage and salty sweet stink of Jack, but there was no real scent, only the memory of it, the imagined power of Brokeback Mountain, of which nothing was left but what he held in his hands. Okay, touching for a million reasons. And I think my only takeaway from this, because I'm realizing more and more that like we can't like prescribe ways to mimic what's done well about these things. We can only talk about them ad nauseum and hope that you like glean something that if you can't put it into use immediately, like it becomes part of your approach somehow. But anyway, obviously what I like about this story so much, going back to it being like a love story, but it's about two characters that want the same thing that they can't have it. So like that's a really powerful premise, and it hits at all these things that I love in stories. stories told in hindsight, nostalgic stories, sad stories, all these kinds of things I like. But I think that's kind of the crux of it. So I think you could easily think of, two characters that want the same thing, but can't have it one character that wants something and never gets it. Like, that's the really powerful premise that you can adopt a million ways. Doesn't have to be about wanting another person. Like maybe there's a place in your life you want to go back to. Maybe your childhood home burned down, or like your child is dead, or like you miss like a moment in time with your sibling when things are still good. Like whatever it is, like that pining. But there's, something to be said for knowing going into the story that they don't get that thing.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that's what adds to the power of the narrator here.
It's about trying to have it.
Yeah, it's about trying to have it. And then, the last line of the story is, if you can't fix it, you've got to stand it, like we said. I mean, that's a powerful premise too.
Yeah.
Just learning how to deal with whatever bullshit. So that's my takeaway. And I can, like I said, think of a million ways that I can use that. And it's basically like, for me, as common in my list of plots is like man versus man, man versus self, man versus nature. Man wanting something you can't have and never gets. That is like, the scholars will say something about me.
There you go.
In that context. Yeah. What is your takeaway, John?
My takeaway is what I was saying about the narration. I love the idea of making the narrator an omniscient, apparently personless, kind of supposedly invisible narrator to be like an expression of the story. It's like the story speaking itself into existence,
Right.
The narrator embodies, through the way in which it speaks, the place, the characters, everything that the story is made up of.
Right.
There's something powerful about that idea in my mind, and I like to explore it. And this story does a fantastic job of doing it.
Right. So, pat on the back, Annie Proulx. Good job, or whatever.
Yeah, you should get that second Pulitzer. If you haven't already. She might have, because she got one in the early 90s for shipping news. And then... I
got to read that then, I guess.
I don't know if she got another one after that, but if she was close with this one, geez.
Yeah, it must feel good to just like know you're that good.
Yeah, really.
I tell myself that, but, imagine it being true.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, guys. If you enjoyed this episode, consider joining our Patreon. Your support helps us keep the show running. Find out more at patreon.com/whyisthisgoodpodcast. And for industry news, writing tips, and great short fiction, join our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/Naples Writers Workshop. You can also subscribe to our monthly newsletter at napleswritersworkshop.com.